The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me real well? I just send us a message through the chat feature if you are having any troubles hearing us at all. So welcome to the PRS Pharmacy Services CBD for Pharmacy webinar. This is our second webinar in the series. My name is Linda Barnes, and I am the Director of Marketing and Strategic Alliances here at PRS. For those of you who may not be familiar with PRS, we are a pharmacist-owned and operated independent pharmacy consulting firm that has been working to help independents since 1982 with everything from compliance to brokerage and now CBD education. If you did not have a chance to attend or listen to our last webinar, not the morning session of this webinar, but our last webinar that we gave, the first one, we do recommend that you do that because we covered a lot of topics in that webinar. As you can see here, we talked about things like what is CBD? We briefly covered the ECS, we discussed laws, the FDA, State Board of Pharmacy statements and rulings, and more. You can head over to prsmarketplace.com and click on the webinars link to view it, and we definitely recommend that you check that out. Okay, we have a lot to cover today. We've had over 100 questions submitted, some about the ECS and some about other topics, and we want to try to get to all of them today. Remember, this webinar is interactive, so if you have questions during the webinar, feel free to ask them using the chat feature, and we will try to answer those as well. The topics we're going to cover today include the endocannabinoid system, called the gatekeeper of homeostasis, and we're going to explore why. The history and discovery of the ECS and CBD and how it works. We will explore cannabinoid receptor types and distribution throughout the body. We're going to talk about the endocannabinoids. We're going to discuss recent FDA information, State Board of Pharmacy rulings, state laws, dosing and interaction information, brands, and lastly, we're going to take any additional questions that you might have. So make sure that you're sending us those questions as the webinar is happening. So we have two experts in the CBD space that will be joining us today. But before I introduce them, I first want to give you a little bit of information to start. One of the two most common questions regarding CBD that we hear is, how can it work on so many different body systems, and why does CBD work? Well, the answer to these questions opens a window into a complex system that science is still making sense of, the endocannabinoid system. So here today to help you understand everything you need to know about CBD and the endocannabinoid system for pharmacy is Evan and Tim Gregorius. And for those of you wondering, no, Evan is not adopted. They actually are related. So Evan joins us as a freelance project advisor here at PRS. He has extensive experience working in the CBD space. Most notably, he has assisted with the formulation of several commercially successful CBD products. He has presented at CBD and cannabis industry conferences, including the 2018 Cannabis Conference in Miami, and VMX 2018, the largest veterinary convention in the U.S. He has worked with numerous CBD companies on their digital marketing efforts and content, and we are happy to have his expertise here today. Our other speaker, our in-house CBD for pharmacy guru, is Tim Gregorius. Tim is a registered pharmacist who is also our current VP of operations here at PRS. He is an expert in the subject of CBD for pharmacy, and most notably is involved in a major project involving education, training, and brand recommendations with a national independent pharmacy organization. So without further delay, I'm going to turn things over to Tim.
Thank you, Linda, and thank everyone for being on this webinar and taking some time out of your day today. Really do appreciate it. So we're talking about the endocannabinoid system for pharmacists. That is a challenging task. We're attempting to describe a system of the human body in 30 or 45 minutes. So whether that happens or not, we'll let you be the judge. We're trying to paint a picture of what is known today of a field of study that's still in its infancy. But if we're able to paint a picture in very broad strokes, we're trying to do that without getting bogged down in detail. However, in those details is exactly where the beauty of this elegant and complex system lies. So as we discussed last time on the June webinar, for those of you who were present for that as well, one of the main topics of conversation was all of the CBD claims that we're hearing in the news, culturally, on the internet, customers coming in and asking us, friends, family. CBD is everywhere, and these just astounding claims that CBD can affect so many different conditions. Well, it looks like, if you're just glancing at that as a fad, that it's the 21st century snake oil, until one grasps how pervasive the endocannabinoid system is in homeostasis and the role that endocannabinoids play in virtually every metabolic reaction in the body. To discuss those, a statement like virtually every metabolic reaction, that becomes substantiated when you think that researchers are telling us now that 650 million years ago, it looks like the endocannabinoid system first appeared in the evolutionary timeline. So, you know, when we start talking about 650 million years occurring in every metabolic reaction, I know these sound like grandiose and exaggerated statements, but if you allow us to look at some simple examples, our hope is at the end of this half hour or so that you'll share with us and develop a curiosity and a respect for a role that the endocannabinoid system plays in every reaction at the cellular level, nearly every reaction. But things that affect diverse conditions like how we sleep, our immune system, depression, pain, cancer. Before I go any further, I would like to sort of color the rest of our discussion in the words of Dr. Ruth Ross, who has been a cannabis, well, at least a endocannabinoid researcher for 20 plus years. In February of this year, she did a TED Talk, and she wanted to make a note that there were 3 myth-busting notions that it's important for everyone to understand if they're going to attempt to understand the endocannabinoid system. The first notion she wanted to do some myth-busting on is that the endocannabinoid system exists in every human before you're born. The endocannabinoid system exists in humans who have never been exposed to cannabis. And thirdly, that the endocannabis system explains how CBD works, but CBD is not why the ECS exists. So to provide a really brief background to frame what we're going to talk about here for the next half hour or so, Evan was working with one of the most prominent CBD manufacturers in the country. And a few years ago, he began to try to get my wife and I to try CBD. Naturally, I resisted, thinking if there was any truth to what he was saying that CBD could do, surely I would know about it, and it'd be common knowledge to the healthcare community. And you know, arrogantly, I was thinking, and surely as a pharmacist, if there was a development like this, that pharmacy would be at the tip of the spear of understanding it. Well, let me publicly apologize to Evan that he was out in front of this phenomenon, and the fact that all of us are here for this webinar and we're present on this call would indicate that the ECS and CBD is much more than we grasped it to be early on.
Okay, I'm going to switch things up a little bit here. We had a ton of questions, and I want to thank everybody for submitting their questions. Please continue to send us your questions during the webinar because we are going to answer those as quickly as we can. So we had over 100 questions, as I said, submitted when everyone registered for the webinars. We were able to group them into some themes. The first being, how does CBD work? And everyone says, what is the mechanism of action? That's what they want to understand.
Yeah, so we're going to try to answer a couple of these thematic questions again in hopes of framing this discussion. What's the mechanism of action of CBD? In a sentence, it inhibits endocannabinoid receptors. But rather than my going any further down that line, Ev, let's not go into the weeds here. We're going to do that in a few minutes. But if you can just briefly tell us a little bit more about the MOA of CBD.
Sure. So as you mentioned, CBD is a negative allosteric modulator of CB1 and CB2 receptors. So it mildly inhibits those receptors. This is important because cannabinoid receptors comprise about 60% of all protein receptors in the human body. There are more cannabinoid receptors than all other receptor types combined in humans. Let that sink in. So by mildly inhibiting those receptors, CBD actually causes the ECS to compensate and upregulate itself in response to that inhibition. So CBD, the net effect is it induces the endocannabinoid system. Secondly, it inhibits key enzymes that are necessary in the inflammatory cascade, very similar to NSAIDs and other anti-inflammatory drugs. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but that's the basic overview.
We're going to use that as an example and visually talk about that a little in a few minutes.
Absolutely. So, and then the second most asked about theme was, why didn't we learn about this in school? So if this endocannabinoid system is such an important system in the body, why didn't we learn about this in pharmacy school? And why aren't they teaching about this in medical school?
And again, for those of you who were on the June webinar, this is something we talked about, and harks back to what I had just mentioned with Evan trying to get my wife and I to try CBD. And as a pharmacist, we're arrogantly thinking, where's this coming from? Is this a fad? How can this be? It is such a new development and a new area of study. And again, we're going to show that here in just a couple of moments. But I just wanted to make sure that we allowed each of you to understand that you didn't miss out on this, or you didn't, it wasn't that you weren't paying attention. This is brand new. This surely was not being taught in pharmacy school when I was in pharmacy school. As a matter of fact, if you're older than about 35 years old, you were already out of pharmacy school before the endocannabinoid system was really discovered. In addition to that, this is just another fact that sort of puts that home a little bit. In 2015, 13% of medical schools in the country even mentioned the endocannabinoid system in its curriculum. So what's that number like?
Well, there are 151 accredited medical schools in this country. And as of November of 2015, 13 of them, or 21 of them, I'm sorry, even mentioned the endocannabinoid system, but did not offer a class on it. So
if you look up there, there's a slide in front of you about the 1940s. How does that have anything to do with something this new? The crazy thing is that when you look at a timeline of endocannabinoids and cannabis and what we know about the endocannabinoid system, we really have to go back to the 1940s when this all kind of started. They were looking to figure out why hemp and why marijuana had the effect it had. They knew there were multiple chemicals. They were trying to elucidate the structure of THC. And if we look at this timeline, it wasn't until the 1960s, so a full 20 years went by, until Raphael Mechoulam isolated the structure of THC. And it looks like just a couple of years later, he finally elucidated the structure of CBD. So that took 20 years for that to happen. He stayed in the game. He's the godfather of THC and CBD work. He stayed in the game for another 30 years. He is still active today. But if you look at that timeline and we go from the early 60s to 92 before anything really substantial happened. And in 1992, he discovered the structure of anandamide. And then just 3 short years later, they elucidated the structure of the second endocannabinoid, 2-AG. Again, just trying to frame the discussion of the endocannabinoid system and why we don't know about it. It wasn't even really on anyone's radar until '88. And then again, the 80s and 90s went through before we started to begin to get an understanding that in 2005 and then in 2018, we've got a lot of drugs, not a lot, we've got a handful of drugs being FDA approved, but we really didn't know how they were working. And again, the reason that we're talking about CBD and these discoveries in terms of the endocannabinoid system is we're trying to make it very obvious that we need to understand the ECS is every bit as large, legitimate, complex, and important a human body system as any of these on the screen, the endocrine, cardiovascular, reproductive. We now talk about, we being the health and all research and medicine, we need to talk about the endocannabinoid system in that same vein. If you do a web search now of the endocannabinoid system, this gentleman's name is going to come up. Ethan Russo is...
I think it's important for us to say who Ethan Russo is so you understand. He's a board certified neurologist. He is currently the science director for International Cannabis and Cannabinoids Institute. And he really was the first person to recognize that there is such a thing as clinical endocannabinoid deficiency. And he is at the forefront of those studies currently, Tim.
Yep. Ethan Russo, he is the man. You know, we don't normally, when we do webinars here at PRS, we're not reading screens. That's probably the last thing people want. But I am going to read this out loud just so you have a, you know, it might give a little bit of emphasis to what he's saying here. The endocannabinoid system is a homeostatic regulatory system that forms the cornerstone of a vast signaling network found in all vertebrates, including humans. The ECS effectively regulates regulation for physiological processes. When we start talking about regulates regulation, that seems like such a bold statement. But, you know, Evan, I want you to speak to this a little bit. How does the endocannabinoid system regulate regulation? How's that possible?
Yeah, that's a pretty profound question, and it has a pretty profound answer. Again, like I said before, there are more cannabinoid receptors, CB1 and CB2, in the human body than all other receptors combined. So that stands on its own. But secondly, the primary endocannabinoids are anandamide, arachidonyl ethanolamide, and 2-AG, which is 2-arachidonyl glycerol. The system is able to manage homeostasis because arachidonic acid, their one precursor, comprises about 25% of all cell membrane lipids. So it's readily available in every cell of every body. Endocannabinoids are produced when a cell is injured or insulted in order to restore homeostasis to that cell. So it's a very basic system in that it's formed from a major constituent of the membrane. There's a sophisticated interplay between anandamide and 2-AG because restoring homeostasis usually can mean different things at different times. Sometimes it means increasing metabolic activity, and sometimes it means decreasing it. So you need a system that's able to function like a volume control that can go up or down rather than a power button that's just on or off. So
that is such a powerful notion that we're talking about here. Homeostasis. I mean, that's a concept that we learn about in 5th grade science class, right? Everybody learns what homeostasis is, and it's necessary for any living organism to always be trying to achieve homeostasis. Well, now this research, and there is phenomenal research going on at this point in time, is telling us that homeostasis happens because of the endocannabinoid system. My first reaction to that is, you got to be kidding. How did we not know this? And this is something we're figuring out literally in the last couple of years, that homeostasis does not exist without the endocannabinoid system. I want to get a little bit into the weeds here. I'm going to let Evan dive down into a little bit more of the chemistry of what's going on here. Bear with us. There's a reason that we're doing this, because we think it's important that you get a basic fundamental understanding of how important the chemical structures are that we're talking about here. And then if you stick with us, we'll expound on why it's important to first have this little bit of a foundational understanding.
yeah, so lipid signaling is obviously involved in many different processes. And the endocannabinoid system is one of the most pervasive lipid signaling systems in chordates, not just mammals, but anything with a spinal cord. Endocannabinoid system enzymes liberate arachidonic acid from the cell membrane, as we mentioned, converting it into the endocannabinoids, anandamide or 2-AG. When these endocannabinoids are degraded, that's the only way that free arachidonic acid can enter the cell. And this is what the immune system uses to trigger inflammation. And it's what the nervous system uses to control all neurotransmission. So it's a fundamental regulatory switch in almost every important biological process.
So I want to try and bring it back here a little bit away from chemistry class and biochemistry. Let's use an example of a condition that has baffled medical science for decades: fibromyalgia, because there are new theories about how and why CBD works in fibromyalgia, and I find this just to be one of the more fascinating areas of study.
Yep, it's fascinating because in its simplicity. Fibromyalgia has been written off for decades because there aren't many clinical differences between the nerves of fibromyalgia patients and the nerves of neurotypical individuals until you look at the endocannabinoid system. The only real common denominator between those with fibromyalgia and is they lack CB1 receptors in their peripheral nerves. The function of CB1 receptors here is to raise the threshold at which sensation becomes pain. So a lack of CB1 receptor means a very low threshold for pain. CBD inhibits the few CB1 receptors that you do have, which is kind of counterintuitive until you realize that it leads your body to compensate by upregulating those CB1 endocannabinoid receptors. And this raises the pain threshold.
So I found that just an incredible concept, that this inducibility, so that someone who has not enough CB receptors, now all of a sudden CBD upregulates, tries to make that into a healthy neuron, that inducing receptors, the expression of endocannabinoid receptors in the body apparently happens upon injury and insult, that it can happen 100-fold. So 100 times of the present receptors allow that to just penetrate your mind. Imagine if that happened with opioid receptors, if they increased by 100-fold, how that would change everything we know about endorphins and how opioids work in the human body and everything else that we're dealing with. That is just a phenomenal example of when this induction is beneficial. Evan, so the endocannabinoid system induces the receptors in response to pain. Pain and the inflammatory process are so closely related. Is this mechanism the same as how NSAIDs work? Because that's, I came away with this first looking at the fibromyalgia and said, well, this looks like NSAIDs. Is that a safe statement?
It's very close, but not exactly. So NSAIDs and other anti-inflammatory drugs inhibit the cyclooxygenase COX-1 and 2 enzymes from producing pro-inflammatory prostaglandins. But the COX enzymes can't liberate arachidonic acid from the membrane. They rely on the endocannabinoids to provide arachidonic acid via their degradation. Only then can the cyclooxygenase enzymes produce prostaglandin and thus initiate inflammation. As you can see in the graphic, the cyclooxygenase COX-1 and 2 enzymes depend on ECS metabolite arachidonic acid to produce inflammation. By preventing the breakdown of endocannabinoids, you starve the immune system of its necessary precursors to produce inflammation. In essence, this anti-inflammatory process works one step before NSAIDs in the same inflammatory cascade. Now, that's all complicated and it sounds like a pharmacology course, but I promise you're all familiar with the drug that works in this exact fashion: Tylenol.
that again was an aha moment for me over the past year when we started studying the ECS and how CBD works. Now, all of a sudden, it's not so mysterious how the ECS seems to hold the key to understanding the mode of action of Tylenol. Of course, then endocannabinoids can work because of their molecular structure. They look like Tylenol. You know, if you go to the next slide, Linda. So there's what they look like. Let's highlight the active portions of each of these molecules. So the active metabolite of acetaminophen, you can see it right there. It looks just like an andamide. So the body is already doing what we over the past few decades have been asking Tylenol to do. That was one of those moments where I looked at that and it just changed how I thought about CBD and the endocannabinoid system, that we're stumbling upon something here that is just so simple that it's amazing that we missed it, but I don't think we're going to miss anything going forward.
And, you know, if you Google what is the mechanism of action of Tylenol, we don't really know. We didn't really know until we learned that its active metabolite is almost identical to the endocannabinoids. And then it was pretty self-explanatory from there.
Yep, that's a great point.
Okay, guys, we're going to move it along here and talk about retrograde signaling and retrograde neurotransmission.
All right. Well, when I saw this slide the first time, and I saw some of the other slides that we've looked at, some graphics, I'm reminded of SSRIs. This graphic looks just like what I was looking at the first time I grasped the concept of how the inhibition of the reuptake process could be leveraged to take advantage of therapeutic value. That the SSRI mode of action was something this simple. And now we're looking at this saying, let's make a connection here, because you've made that connection for me in a big way. Let's see if we can let people see that.
Yeah, so when we discovered, how neurons work and what a synapse is, we knew that it released, one neuron releases a neurotransmitter to another neuron, which has an effect. But we didn't really know much more than that. And, it was postulated that there has to be some sort of feedback control mechanism in the opposite direction to regulate neurotransmission. Well, it's called the endocannabinoid system. And that is part of the reason why cannabinoid receptors make up 60% of all receptors, because they regulate about 20 different neurotransmitter systems, including glutamate, GABA, dopamine, and serotonin. And that reverse retrograde signaling of endocannabinoids regulates the forward neurotransmission of the primary neurotransmitter.
So, no, go ahead forward, Linda. Sorry. So, when we had mentioned Ethan Russo. I want to come back to Ethan Russo here for a moment, because this is not something, when we're talking about CBD and we're all trying to figure out what's going on, is this a fad? How can we be talking about the ECS in such profound ways right now? Ethan Russo is doing active studies today. There is a symposium coming up in September 10th to 12th in Boston. It's for the International Cannabis and Cannabinoid Institute. What he's going to be doing is laying out the logic that we can't unknow what we now know, that drug design moving forward has to, by necessity, consider the endocannabinoid system. You and I had talked about, this is one of those moments where this is such a big deal, and that's what I'm trying to get across to those of you on this webinar with us, that this isn't a fad, this isn't just CBD, my patients are not sure should they smoke it or take it sublingually. This has caused us to stumble, and I say us, the medical community, to stumble onto this ECS and how vast and important it is. that now no drugs will even be considered for design into the future without considering the endocannabinoid system. And you had a great point.
Well, yeah, we learned the absolute pervasiveness of this system, and that it can't be ignored going forwards. But then they thought, well, let's look backwards and see, maybe what we didn't see in the first place. And what they found is that this is crazy, about 80% of legend drugs have an important effect on the endocannabinoid system in how they work. That, everything from sedatives to antipsychotics to, some cancer drugs, they work in the ways that we thought they work in the first place, and also on the endocannabinoid system. So
drugs that we've been dispensing now for decades, we didn't even understand it. They're affecting the endocannabinoid system. And so, anytime you're doing research on this and looking into things, and you read a patient package insert now, and it's a completely different frame of reference.
Okay, I think now would be a good time to maybe take a couple of the questions that we had and answer them before we get into the meat of things. So, Ed, this one's for you. So people want to know about aging. What can you tell us? I mean, we did talk about, the disrupting the endocannabinoid signaling and what that can do, but people want to know about aging. What happens to your endocannabinoid system as you age?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of ways that that's involved. The most important and the most simple way is that cannabinoid receptors act as a sort of biological countdown clock for the cellular age, which is measured in days, not years. So as your cells lose cannabinoids, eventually they drop below a critical threshold, and apoptosis is triggered directly via that, a cannabinoid mediated system. Another profound and, relatively new development is the telomere effect, which won the Nobel Prize in 2009. The researcher Blackburn, she posited that as telomeres, basically the end cap sort of regulators of chromosomes, as you age, they degrade. You lose the telomeres, and eventually that causes the chromosomes to be degraded. And what they found is that it's an endocannabinoid regulated antioxidant process that protects against that telomere breakdown. And whenever that endocannabinoid mediated process is reduced as you age, that sort of allows the telomeres to be broken down. It's also involved in Alzheimer's and many other processes, but that encompasses it.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to move along here because we had tons of questions about the endocannabinoid system, and we'll probably get to a few more of those a little bit later, but we want to kind of move on because we had questions about the FDA, dosing, State Board of Pharmacy, those types of things. So let's move on to the FDA because I think that's really important for people to understand what's happening there.
Yep. Our goal was to try to get through the highlights of the endocannabinoid system in the first 40 minutes or so, so that we could sort of pull together, because all of you have questions, certainly not just about the endocannabinoid system that we're concentrating on today, but am I allowed to sell CBD and the dosing? And there's so many questions like that. Let's start at the top and talk about the FDA and where we are in a regulatory sense right now. So just setting up a little historical reference, in December of 2018, President Trump signed the Farm Bill, which in effect removed hemp from a Schedule 1 scheduling. So that sort of changed everything, and I'm not going to go back into that historically. But on the same day that President Trump signed the Farm Bill, the FDA came out and made a statement, and that statement still holds today. They were very clear. They're still in charge, and CBD is a drug. Make no mistake about that. It's a drug. Yeah, it's a fad. Yeah, it's being sold in gas stations, and that's causing us a lot of grief and situations right now. But it is a drug, and the FDA is not letting us forget that. On May 31st, they held an open hearing that I think a couple of hundred people presented at. They had the open comment time was until July 2nd, and then they promised they would be making a statement in the next 60 days. So we are in that 60-day time period right now, and we're expecting a statement from the FDA in the late summer, early fall. In the meantime, if one thinks that the FDA doesn't understand what's going on or how important that is, I'm going to read something here by Dr. Amy Abernathy. She's the FDA Deputy Commissioner, and she made note of 5 key takeaways from the May 31st hearing. Just going to blow through those. 1, there's a serious need for regulatory clarity. Consumer safety is paramount. Nationwide labeling requirements are coming. Dosing guidelines are necessary, and time is of the essence. It's not lost on the FDA where we are, but the reality is it has set up a lot of confusion because individual state boards of pharmacy have come out and made statements based on these FDA statements. So there are approximately 15 states, and I say approximately because these rulings and these statements are changing on what seems to be a daily basis. But there were 13 at last count, and I believe there have been two more statements. So in 15 states, the State Board of Pharmacy has basically told pharmacists, do not sell CBD, don't have it on your shelves. Not because it's illegal, just let's be smart and let's wait till the FDA comes out with guidelines, because if we're selling it in pharmacy, we're going to be held accountable to the FDA and to state and federal regulations. So knowing that these states have made these statements, well, you know, let me interrupt myself there for a moment. The good news is that means there's 35 states where the State Board of Pharmacy has stayed silent. So, you know, 2/3 of us can go ahead and sell CBD in our pharmacies without any fear, because the State Board of Pharmacy, remaining silent, has said, yeah, let's wait till the FDA comes out. In the meantime, don't do anything stupid. Because the fear that the state boards of pharmacy have is that the FDA made very clear back in December of 2018 that you cannot make a therapeutic claim regarding CBD. Whether you're a manufacturer, a marketer, a healthcare provider, that's where that line is drawn. And let's not step over that line, folks. We can't make a therapeutic claim. That's kind of the ground rules, and that's the out of bounds lines.
Yeah, one of the big questions that we had, and I think this is a great time to speak to this, is, you know, someone asked this question, which I thought was pretty poignant, is what is real and what is not real? So how does someone know what's real and what isn't real? And I think that means, or we think it means, product and also
when I read that question, it's a great question, and I really wasn't sure. I read it 2 different ways. What's real? I can promise you that the endocannabinoid system is real, and that CBD is a drug. And if that's not what you meant by the question, and I'm not really sure, but what's real and what's not real, if you're talking about actual CBD and individual CBD products, that's a different answer to that question. CBD products and the different manufacturers, that's on us, guys. We need to know what's in the bottle. If we're going to be recommending and selling and handing CBD products into our patients' hands, there's a lot of variability out there. I've seen studies that say 30% of manufacturers' brands that were tested were mislabeled, didn't have that amount of CBD in the bottle that it said on the label. And I've seen it where as much as 80% of brands that were tested didn't have that amount of CBD on the label. So what's real and what's not real, it's buyer beware. We're going to need to be careful, guys, that when we're dispensing CBD products, that we're not making the mistake that we don't know what's in the bottle. And one of the ways that we can do that is this has become pretty uniform in all of the respectable companies that are out there. There should be a certificate of analysis attached to each individual product. So you should be able to, either using a QR code or a batch number and going to a website, to be able to produce the assay that a third-party lab tested that exact product you're holding in your hand, and that you could look at the certificate of analysis.
Absolutely. So one of the other, we get this all the time, and I know you've had many discussions. It's about interactions. The questions are about dosing. So can you speak to that a little bit? Because I know there's a lot of people attending our webinars and that have, emailed you and had personal discussions with you about those particular things.
Absolutely. And dosing is one of those areas where clearly, as I had just stated, the FDA has gone ahead and made it very clear that we can't be making claims, therapeutic claims. So in this forum, I am not going to be making any claims. I have personal stories that I can share. And actually, between the first webinar this morning and over lunchtime, I fielded 2 phone calls from pharmacists that were asking very specific questions about the dosing. And in that setting, I will gladly tell you everything I know to be true and that I believe. But one of the things we can talk about is the routes of administration and the dosage forms, so that we need to understand as pharmacists that if somebody is taking an ingestible, if they're taking a gummy bear, which is a pretty common ingestible that's out there, the gummies that are infused with CBD, if they're taking that orally, we know then that CBD undergoes first pass metabolism, which means that the bioavailability of that CBD is going to be in the 2 to 6 or 7% range, certainly below 10% after first pass. So, I'm getting 25 milligrams of CBD. No, you're not. You might be getting 1 or 2 milligrams, depending how your body handles that CBD. So, we need to understand the routes of administration and the dosage forms. It looks like the absolute best way to get the highest bioavailability and to get it into the body is to smoke and vape the different products. We're drawing a line there and saying, no way, not in pharmacy. That's not where we're going to go. That's not the products we're talking about. That's why the CBD sublingual oil is without a doubt the most common way to be taking CBD in the country today. We have and this is all tied in the dosing and routes of administration and interactions, because we're doing a real quick pharmaceutics class here on this, real quick 5 minutes. That we do know that CBD is metabolized by the P450 enzymes CYP3A4 and CYP2C19. So knowing that, and if anyone is familiar with pharmacogenetics, pharmacogenomics, we understand that there are probably 600 drugs that have some form of interaction, some very mild, but nonetheless, if we know CBD is being metabolized by the same enzymes that are metabolizing other drugs people are on, there's going to be an interaction. We do know that warfarin and valproic acid are significant. So that's something that each of us has to be aware of. We have a patient on valproic acid or warfarin. Sometimes concomitant use of CBD can require a dosage adjustment of 30% on their warfarin. So again, not something we can take lightly. However, what we do know about CBD and the drug interactions, we know from Epidiolex. Everything that we formally know as healthcare providers, and as the FDA has reminded us several times, everything that we know about that world, we know because of the studies with Epidiolex, which were not extensive studies, and they were treating a pediatric population with 2 very specific and rare conditions, the epileptic conditions that Epidiolex has been approved to treat. So to make the transfer of knowledge of what these interactions are into a healthy adult or an adult taking 5 other medications, that's why the FDA is saying, hold on, and we've got some state boards of pharmacy saying, let's just wait until this is all a little more clear. So there's a lot of confusion. Let's not be confused. Let's look at what we know. There's some gray areas, but let's not let that confuse us. CBD is a drug. CBD works for a lot of people, and we need to understand it. This is about education and understanding. Linda, I skipped over a point. Let me backtrack on myself here for a moment. I wanted to use Ohio as an example of a state board of pharmacy situation where the clarity that's lacking right now when we're talking federal regulations, state regulations, and then state board of pharmacy regulations. In Ohio, Governor DeWine just at the beginning of this week, I believe, might have been the end of last week, signed a bill basically legalizing hemp as an agricultural product in Ohio. So Ohio farmers can now legally grow and sell hemp. That sounds like, oh, it's now CBD is going to be legal in Ohio. No, State Board of Pharmacy still says, no, it isn't. The FDA says what the FDA has said. And, that leads to a lot of confusion because it's not illegal, but if the State Board of Pharmacy is telling us we're not going to be selling that off our shelves, that's something that you need to be aware of if you're an Ohio pharmacist. That just paints a good picture of the confusion that is surrounding state and federal laws and regulations. Again, don't let it trip you up, but you need to be aware of it.
Yeah, we actually had somebody ask the question, can't you just Google and find a map that has different states highlighted that show with which states it's legal and which states it's not legal in?
I can tell you what's going to happen if any of you Googled right now a map showing where CBD is legal. What's going to pop up is an interactive map on medical marijuana. It's going to show you the states that medical marijuana and recreational use marijuana laws are. Be very careful when you're doing research on your own. Make sure that you're looking and understanding those sorts of subtleties.
Okay, I think we can take some questions. Somebody asked the question, other than being non-psychoactive, how does CBD differ from THC? What can we say about that?
Ev, I'm going to let you answer.
Yeah, I'll take this one. So this is pretty simple. THC acts as an agonist, a partial agonist of CB1 and CB2 receptors. CBD acts as an inhibitor of the same receptors. So their actions are essentially opposite. And that is evidenced by nabiximols, or Sativex, which was approved in the UK and Germany, I believe, in 2005. It's a 50-50 mixture of CBD and THC. And interestingly, it produced no psychoactive effects. But it still was able to significantly relieve epilepsy and neuropathic pain. So it still had an effect, it just didn't have a psychoactive effect. So that sort of illustrates the balance achieved by CBD and THC, and that sparked a whole new path into entourage effect and synergy.
The majority of us on this phone call are pharmacists, and we're not touching the THC. We need to understand that, and each of you needs to that question. I get why the question is asked, but we need to keep THC out of the products that we're dealing with, and keep THC sort of off on the side.
Kind of moving along the same thought, is it safe for law enforcement and military who get drug tested, or really anybody who gets drug tested? Is CBD safe for them to take?
So to answer that question the way it's written, yes, CBD is, provided that you're getting the CBD from a reliable source. So if you're taking CBD and you're getting CBD, yeah, it's not going to make you fail. It's never going to show up and you're going to fail a test, because those tests that I believe the person is asking here about the military and law enforcement is THC. CBD is not THC. Where you run into a problem is if you've got a manufacturer who is just not living up to the correct standards. And back to what I said before, the certificate of analysis, that if you have to have trust that what it says on the bottle is actually what's in the bottle. And if so, obviously that comes back then to each of us and personal accountability. We got to be buying our products from reliable manufacturers, and there are plenty of them out there. There are not just one or two that are worthy to be sold in pharmacy or for us to be talking about. There are, what I can tell, 10, 15, 20. But there are plenty out there, and some of them are being shut down as we speak that just are not living up to those standards. So again, it's a buyer beware.
Absolutely. Somebody did ask a question, and I know you had mentioned this a little bit ago, Evan, but they want to know specifically about the research that may be done, or has there been any research done on CBD and its effects on Alzheimer's, sleep, the wandering mind, that type of thing?
Yeah, so a lot of conditions that seem to be idiopathic in the sense that we don't know what the root cause is. We may understand the pathophysiology of it. Alzheimer's disease is caused by the buildup of amyloid beta plaque, but we don't know why that occurs. We just know that it does occur and it leads to the symptoms of Alzheimer's. Well, many conditions like that, that we don't know the origin of, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, essentially all of them have a endocannabinoid deficiency involved with them, which is back to Ethan Russo and why he hit this and realized, wow, this might be, a gold mine here of physiological understanding. The endocannabinoid system regulates a lot of the antioxidant properties, endogenous, inherent in the human body. And whenever that system falls out of whack, we have, symptoms or diseases that crop up in aging and in neurodegeneration that with a little bit of induction of the endocannabinoid system can be attenuated and even reversed in some cases. And Alzheimer's seems to be one of those instances where endocannabinoid system modulation is extremely effective in at least staving off some of those symptoms.
Okay, awesome. So I want to mention something. We did change the screen. We have some sources up there. These, when we're talking about what's real and what isn't real, I think it's important for you to understand that there are sources that you can trust. If you're getting it from us, you absolutely can, because we make sure that we are vetting the sources that we get our information from, and we try to stay as scientific as possible. I know there's a lot of information out there. That's something that Tim had talked about too as well.
That's a great point.
So those are up there for you. So, anyone who is listening and attending right now, this will be available to you, and certainly you can check these out. Start there. Start your knowledge search there. So one of the other questions that we had was, do I get CE credits for this?
Not today. I apologize. We are working on that, and actually what we're hoping to be able to do is retroactively get CE credit for today's webinar as well as the June webinar. But we are working on making sure that these webinars in the future, it'll probably be sometime in October, will be the third part of this series that we plan to have CE credit available. Yeah, my apologies.
Absolutely. So the last question we had was, how can I increase sales with CBD, and is it important for me to be the expert in CBD?
That is such a good question. I don't know who put that out there. Looks like Matt. Increasing sales, being the expert, I would say we wouldn't dare try to increase sales unless we were the expert. And how does one become the expert? One educates oneself. So I know we're trying to do that here. We're trying to assist each of you in that education process. And each of you, obviously, if you're on this call, you are interested in educating yourself. And that's where it starts. This is such a massive undertaking to understand. We're not just now, as I said before, trying to talk about a fad. Is there some new fad? This is fundamentally changing pharmacy going forward. We can't pretend that we now don't understand the endocannabinoid system play in all of this, and that's why people like Russo are so powerful at this moment in time. But can CBD help you increase sales? Absolutely. I would just caution against trying to increase sales willy-nilly without making sure that you are the expert and to continue to educate yourself.
So that leaves us with brands. I know there have been a ton of questions about brands. Tim's information is up on the screen here. Please feel free to contact him. I know brands is something that we're currently working on, with our project that we're doing right now, and we're vetting different companies. Of course, everyone knows we do sell one particular brand, but we do recognize that there are multiple brands out there that are doing great work and have a wonderful product. So Tim will be more than happy to have those discussions with you. If you have any other questions that were not answered during this webinar, please feel free to reach out to him.
I'm glad you said that, Linda, because I don't want to paint the picture that that there's not a lot of manufacturers out there that are pharmacy worthy. And I say that again, not to be arrogant, but for all the reasons that we've discussed here, we need to make sure that if a pharmacist is, putting product into a customer or a patient's hands, we have to have a lot of confidence in what that product has done to ensure that it's worthy of that transaction. And PRS, we're endeavoring toward that, and there are companies out there that you need to be wary of. Definitely want to say that, but let that not shade us to the fact that there are plenty of good companies out. Evan, looked like you wanted to say something a couple minutes ago. No,
No,
Not really.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'd really like to thank everybody for attending. Please, again, like I said, feel free to reach out to Tim if you have any additional questions or you really want to, get into the weeds with a particular subject. We like to keep him busy. He'll be super busy with phone calls and emails, but please send that to him. The other thing we'd like you to do is, because this is interactive and because we want to get your feedback, we'd like you to email us your suggestions for future webinars. We're thinking that the next one may be on brands. We hope we'll be having a nice big announcement to be making at that time too, but please email us any additional, questions or subjects that you really want to see covered in future webinars. Thanks everyone for attending.
Yeah, thank you. And I do sincerely want to invite you to call me or email. I would absolutely invite conversations. As I said, we've already had a couple of conversations between these two webinars today. Evan, thank you.
Absolutely.
Linda.
My pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Good job.